The stranger arrived in Clifton Hill, Missouri on a Tuesday afternoon in late August 1878, when the heat pressed down like a wool blanket, and even the flies moved slowly through the dusty air. Tanner Brooks noticed her the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, because she wore long sleeves buttoned tight at the wrists, despite the oppressive temperature that had every other soul in town seeking shade and cool water. She carried a single worn carpetbag, and held herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in the world. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a plain bonnet, and her eyes, a striking green that reminded him of new spring grass, swept across the main street with a mixture of hope and wariness that tugged at something deep in his chest. Tanner had been leaning against the post outside the general store, his hat tipped low against the sun, when he saw her nearly stumble on the coach step. Without thinking, he pushed off from his spot and covered the distance between them in a few long strides. He reached out to steady her elbow, but she flinched away so sharply that he immediately pulled back, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Apologies, miss," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to startle you. That step's been loose for near about a month now. Old Henderson keeps meaning to fix it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the fear flash across her features before she schooled them into careful neutrality. "Thank you for the warning," she said, her voice soft but clear. She had an accent he couldn't quite place, something Eastern maybe, refined but worn down at the edges like a good book that had been read too many times. "You need help with your bag," he offered, making sure to keep his distance, to keep his voice gentle the way he would with a spooked horse. "I can manage." She gripped the carpetbag tighter, and he noticed how the fabric of her sleeve pulled taut across her wrist. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he could see a bead of sweat trailing down her temple, but she made no move to roll up those sleeves or loosen her collar. "I don't doubt it," Tanner said, offering her a small smile. "But the boarding house is about 3 blocks down, and this heat's nothing to take lightly. At least let me walk with you, make sure you get there safe. Name's Tanner Brooks. I work at the Double B Ranch just outside town." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "Margaret Preston, and I suppose the company would be appreciated." They started walking down the wide dirt street, Tanner keeping a respectful distance between them. The town was quiet in the afternoon heat, most folks inside until the sun started its descent. A few chickens scratched in the dust outside the livery stable, and somewhere a dog barked half-heartedly before giving up. "You come from far?" he asked, making conversation but also genuinely curious. Clifton Hill wasn't exactly a destination most people aimed for. It was the kind of town you passed through or ended up in when you had nowhere else to go. "Far enough," Margaret answered, and he heard the weight of that distance in her voice. It wasn't just miles she was talking about. "Got family here?" "No." The word came out flat, final. Tanner nodded, understanding that some questions weren't meant to be answered. He had his own past he didn't talk about, his own reasons for ending up in this dusty corner of Missouri. "Mrs. Callahan runs the boarding house. She's good people, fair with her prices and doesn't pry too much. Makes a fine apple pie too when the season's right." That earned him a ghost of a smile, just a slight curve at the corner of Margaret's mouth. "That's good to know." They walked in silence for a bit, and Tanner found himself stealing glances at her. She couldn't be more than 22 or 23, he figured, which made her about his age. There was something beautiful about her, though it was the kind of beauty that had been dimmed by hardship, like a lamp turned down low. He wondered what had brought her to Clifton Hill, what she was running from, because he recognized the look of someone running. "I'm looking for work," Margaret said suddenly, as if she felt the need to fill the silence. I can sew and I'm good with numbers. I kept books for a shop back in. She stopped herself, and Tanner pretended not to notice. I'm a hard worker. Well, Mrs. Henderson at the general store could use some help. Her arthritis has been acting up something fierce, makes it hard for her to do the detail work. And old Mr. Patterson's been looking for someone to help with his books at the feed and grain. He's honest, pays fair. Margaret glanced at him, that wariness still present but softened slightly. You're very helpful to a stranger. That's what neighbors do, Tanner said simply. Besides, Clifton Hill could use some new blood. Gets pretty quiet around here. They reached the boarding house, a two-story structure with a sagging porch that Mrs. Callahan kept swept clean despite the constant dust. Tanner called out a greeting, and a moment later, a round woman in her 50s appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Tanner Brooks, what brings you to town in the middle of a work day? She asked, her eyes twinkling with good humor. Brought you a new guest, Mrs. Callahan. This is Miss Margaret Preston. She just arrived on the stage. Mrs. Callahan's expression shifted immediately to warm welcome. Well, come in, child. You must be roasted alive in this heat. I've got fresh lemonade and we can discuss room and board. She ushered Margaret toward the door, then paused to look back at Tanner. You coming to the social on Saturday? Hadn't planned on it, he admitted. Well, you should. All work and no play makes for a dull life. She winked at him and then turned her attention back to Margaret. Come along, dear. Margaret looked back at Tanner, and for a moment their eyes met. Thank you, she said, and he could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. For your kindness. You're welcome, Miss Preston. I hope Clifton Hill treats you well. As he walked back toward where he'd left his horse hitched outside the saloon, Tanner found his thoughts lingering on Margaret Preston and her long sleeves in the summer heat. He'd seen enough of life to know that people carried their wounds in different ways. Whatever hers were, she was trying to hide them, and he respected that. But something in her eyes had called to him, had made him want to offer more than just directions and introductions. He rode back to the ranch thinking about green eyes and careful smiles, and wondering if he'd see her again. The next few days passed in the usual rhythm of ranch work. Tanner rose before dawn, spent his mornings mending fences and checking cattle, his afternoons breaking horses, and his evenings so bone-tired he could barely keep his eyes open through supper. The Double B was owned by Bernard Bailey, a gruff but fair man who treated his ranch hands decently and paid them on time. Tanner had been working there for 2 years now, ever since he drifted into Clifton Hill with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a desire to leave his past in Texas far behind. But even exhausted and sun-baked, he found his mind wandering to Margaret Preston. He wondered if she'd found work, if Mrs. Callahan was treating her well, if she was settling into the town. On Friday afternoon, when Bernard sent him into town to pick up supplies, Tanner's pulse quickened at the possibility of seeing her again. He found her in Henderson's general store, standing on a small ladder and reaching for bolts of fabric on the high shelves, while Mrs. Henderson called out instructions from below. Margaret had her back to him, and he could see how carefully she moved, how she kept her sleeves buttoned even though her face was flushed from the heat and the exertion. A bit to the left, dear, Mrs. Henderson was saying. The blue calico, yes, that's the one. Margaret retrieved the bolt and climbed down, turning to hand it to the older woman. That's when she spotted Tanner, and he saw surprise flicker across her features, followed by something that might have been pleasure. Mr. Brooks, she said, a bit breathlessly. Miss Preston. He touched the brim of his hat. Good to see you. Looks like you found employment. Thanks to your recommendation, Margaret said. She set the fabric bolt on the counter and smoothed her hands down her skirts. Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to take a chance on me. Kind nothing, Mrs. Henderson interjected, bustling over. Girl's a natural, got an eye for color, and she's already reorganized my entire inventory system. Found things I'd lost track of years ago. She beamed at Margaret with genuine affection. Now, what can I get for you, Tanner? Let me guess, Bernard sent you with a list as long as your arm. Tanner grinned and pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. You know the boss, always needs something. While Mrs. Henderson started gathering the items on the list, Tanner found himself standing near Margaret, searching for something to say. She looked better than she had on Tuesday. Some of the exhaustion eased from her features, though she still held herself with that careful guardedness. You settling in all right? He asked. I am. Mrs. Callahan's boarding house is comfortable and everyone's been very welcoming. She paused, then added, more welcoming than I expected, honestly. Told you. Clifton Hill's a good town for the most part. We take care of our own. I'm not sure I'm one of your own yet, Margaret said, but there was a hint of hope in her voice. You're here, aren't you? That's a start. Tanner leaned against the counter, making sure to keep his posture relaxed, unthreatening. You coming to the social tomorrow? There'll be music and dancing, and half the county brings food. It's actually pretty enjoyable, even for folks like me who don't much care for crowds. Margaret's expression shuddered slightly. I don't think so. I'm still getting settled and I don't really know anyone. You know me, Tanner pointed out gently. And Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Callahan, that's 3 people already. Besides, it's a good way to meet the rest of the town. People are curious about newcomers, but in a friendly way mostly. She looked down at her hands, and Tanner noticed again how she tugged at her sleeves, making sure they covered her wrists completely. I'm not much for dancing. Neither am I, if I'm honest. 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm, but the food's good and you can just watch if you want. No pressure. He wasn't sure why he was pushing the issue, except that he wanted to see her there, wanted to make sure she didn't isolate herself completely. Mrs. Henderson came back with her arms full of supplies. Oh, you should definitely come to the social, Margaret. Tanner's right, it's the best way to meet everyone at once, get it all over with in one go. And besides, you've been working so hard this week, you deserve a bit of fun. Margaret looked between them, clearly wavering. Finally, she sighed, but it was a gentle sound, almost amused. All right. I suppose it couldn't hurt. That's the spirit, Mrs. Henderson said, already beaming. I'll walk over with you if you like, so you won't have to go alone. I'd appreciate that, Margaret said, and some of the tension eased from her shoulders. Tanner helped load the supplies into the wagon outside, trying not to feel as pleased as he did that Margaret had agreed to come to the social. It wasn't his business whether she came or not, he told himself. She was just a new person in town, and he was being neighborly. That was all. But as he drove the wagon back to the ranch, he caught himself wondering what Margaret Preston might look like with her hair down, and a smile on her face, really smiling, not just those careful half-expressions she allowed herself. He wondered what it would take to make her feel safe enough to let her guard down. The social was held in the open area behind the church, where someone had strung up lanterns, and a few of the ranch hands had set up a makeshift stage for the musicians. By the time Tanner arrived, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt, the party was already in full swing. He spotted Bernard and his wife dancing enthusiastically, if not gracefully, and a group of children racing around the edges of the crowd in some complicated game only they understood. He was scanning the crowd, looking for Margaret, though he wouldn't admit that to himself, when he felt a hand clap him on the shoulder. Tanner Brooks, as I live and breathe, came a familiar voice. Didn't think you'd actually show up to one of these things. Tanner turned to find James Wheeler, another ranch hand from the Double B, grinning at him. Could say the same for you. Yeah, well, Sarah told me if I didn't come and dance with her at least once, she'd make my life hell. James jerked his chin toward his wife, who was chatting with a group of women near the food tables. What's your excuse? Just felt like getting out, Tanner said with a shrug. James gave him a knowing look. Heard there's a new girl in town, pretty thing working at Henderson's. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Before Tanner could answer, he spotted Margaret arriving with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Callahan flanking her like protective hens. She was wearing a different dress than he'd seen before, still simple but a soft blue color that brought out her eyes. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and despite the warm evening she still wore long sleeves. That her? James asked, following Tanner's gaze. That's Miss Preston, Tanner confirmed. Well, she looks terrified. You better go rescue her before the vultures descend. James was right. Already, Tanner could see a few of the town's eligible bachelors taking notice of the new arrival. Tanner made his way through the crowd, arriving just as Mrs. Callahan was introducing Margaret to the mayor's wife. Margaret's smile was polite but strained, and her hand kept moving to her opposite wrist, a nervous gesture that Tanner was beginning to recognize. "Evening, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "Miss Preston, would you care for some punch? I hear Mrs. Wilson made her special recipe." Margaret's eyes met his, and he saw relief flood her features. "That sounds lovely, Mr. Brooks." He offered his arm, careful to keep the gesture casual, and was surprised when she actually took it, though her touch was light enough that he barely felt it through his sleeve. They moved away from the cluster of well-meaning but overwhelming women, and Margaret let out a breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know they mean well, but it's a lot all at once. They're excited. New people are rare around here, but I figure you might appreciate a moment to breathe." He led her to the punch table and ladled out 2 cups of the bright red liquid. "Fair warning, Mrs. Wilson's punch is about 80% sugar." Margaret took a sip and her eyebrows rose. "That's remarkably sweet. Told you." Tanner grinned. "But the food's much better. You hungry?" They filled plates with chicken and potato salad, fresh bread and pickles, and found a spot at one of the long tables that had been set up under the trees. The lantern light cast everything in a warm glow, and the music drifted over them, a lively fiddle tune that had several couples spinning around the makeshift dance floor. "This is nice," Margaret admitted after a few minutes of eating in comfortable silence. "Different from what I'm used to, but nice." "What were you used to?" Tanner asked, then immediately added, "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. "Cities," she finally said. "Crowds, but not the friendly kind. Just a lot of people all pressed together, all trying to survive." She took a bite of chicken, chewed thoughtfully. "This is more personal. That it is. Hard to have secrets in a town this size, which is both good and bad." She glanced at him sharply, and Tanner cursed himself for his choice of words. "I just mean, people notice things, care about things. Your business becomes everyone's business sometimes, but it also means people look out for each other." Margaret relaxed slightly. "I suppose that's true." They continued eating, and Tanner found himself studying her in the lantern light. She was beautiful, he decided, but it was a fragile kind of beauty, like she might shatter if handled roughly. He wanted to ask about the sleeves, about what she was hiding, but he knew better. People shared their secrets when they were ready, if they ever were. "Miss Preston," a voice called out, and they both looked up to see young Tommy Richards approaching, hat in hand and looking nervous. He couldn't be more than 19, the son of the local blacksmith. "I was wondering if you might like to dance." Margaret's expression turned almost panicked, and she shook her head quickly. "Oh no, I couldn't. I'm not much of a dancer, and I'm still eating, and the lady said no, Tommy," Tanner interjected gently but firmly. Maybe another time." Tommy looked disappointed but nodded and backed away. As soon as he was gone, Margaret turned to Tanner. "I hope I didn't offend him." "You didn't. He'll survive. And you're allowed to say no to things that make you uncomfortable. Thank you for understanding." She pushed her food around her plate. "I'm sure people must think it's strange that I don't want to dance or socialize much. People think lots of things. Doesn't mean you have to care about all of them." Tanner finished his chicken and set down his fork. "You want to take a walk? Get away from the crowd for a bit. There's a nice view of the creek from just over the hill." Margaret hesitated, and Tanner could practically see her weighing the offer, trying to determine if he was trustworthy. Finally, she nodded. "A walk sounds nice." They disposed of their plates and began walking toward the edge of the gathering, where the lantern light faded and the stars became visible overhead. It was a beautiful night, the heat of the day finally breaking into something more comfortable, and the sound of crickets rose to compete with the music behind them. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Brooks," Margaret said as they walked slowly along the path toward the creek. "You've been very patient with me." "Just Tanner, please, and it's not patience exactly, more like, I figure everyone's got their reasons for being how they are, not my place to judge or push. Still, it's more than many people would offer." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "How long have you been in Clifton Hill?" "About 2 years now. Came from Texas originally." "What brought you here?" Tanner smiled ruefully. "Seemed like a good place to start over. Sometimes you need to leave the past behind and make a new start, you know." "I do know," Margaret said softly, and there was such understanding in her voice that Tanner felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared experience. They reached the top of the small hill, and below them the creek glinted in the starlight, a ribbon of silver winding through the dark landscape. Margaret stopped and looked out at the view, and for the first time since Tanner had met her, her expression seemed peaceful. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Yeah, it is." But Tanner was looking at her when he said it. She must have felt his gaze because she turned to him, and in the darkness, with just the stars overhead, she seemed more relaxed, more herself. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone, could have done anything." Tanner thought about that, really thought about it. "I guess because I remember what it's like to show up somewhere new, feeling like you're one wrong move away from falling apart. Someone was kind to me when I first got here. Bernard gave me a job when I had no references, no past I was willing to talk about. Mrs. Callahan let me stay at the boarding house even though I couldn't pay her for the first month. People gave me a chance to prove myself." He met her eyes. "Figure I should do the same for others when I can." Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she looked away quickly, blinking them back. "That's a very generous way to live. Not generous, just human." He wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but he kept his hands at his sides. Respecting the distance she needed, they stood there for a while, listening to the creek and the distant music, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Margaret shivered slightly, and Tanner immediately offered, "You cold? We can head back." Maybe that would be best. They walked back slowly, and when they reached the edge of the social again, Margaret surprised him by touching his arm lightly. "Thank you, Tanner. For the walk, for the conversation, for everything." "Anytime, Margaret." He used her first name deliberately, testing the waters, and saw her small smile in response. "I should find Mrs. Callahan. She'll want to head back soon." "All right, I'll see you around town, I expect." "I expect so." Tanner watched her walk back into the lantern light, already feeling the loss of her presence. James appeared at his elbow, startling him. "You've got it bad, my friend," James said, shaking his head with amusement. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't. That's why you spent the whole evening with her, and you're standing here watching her like a lovesick puppy." Tanner punched James's arm without any real force. "Shut up." But as he rode back to the ranch that night, he couldn't deny that James might have a point. There was something about Margaret Preston that had gotten under his skin, past all the defenses he'd built up over the years. He wanted to know her, to understand her, to make her smile for real. And more than that, he wanted to protect her from whatever it was that made her flinch at unexpected touches and hide her arms even in summer heat. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Tanner found reasons to come into town more often than strictly necessary, and more often than not, he'd end up at Henderson's general store, ostensibly for supplies but really just to see Margaret. They'd talk while she worked, conversations that started shallow but gradually deepened as she began to trust him. He learned that she loved books, that she'd read everything she could get her hands on as a child, that she had a sharp wit hidden under all that careful politeness, and when she felt safe enough to let it show, it delighted him. That she hummed while she worked, soft little melodies she probably didn't even realize she was making, but he also noticed the things she didn't say. She never talked about her family, never mentioned where exactly she'd come from or what had brought her to Missouri. She never rolled up her sleeves, even when she was unpacking heavy crates or reaching into dusty corners. And she still flinched sometimes when someone moved too quickly near her or raised their voice, even in laughter. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-September when things began to change. Tanner had come into town to pick up a saddle Bernard had ordered from the leather worker, and he stopped by the general store on his way back, as had become his habit. But instead of finding Margaret arranging goods or helping customers, he found Mrs. Henderson looking worried. "Tanner, thank goodness. Have you seen Margaret?" His stomach dropped. "No, madam, isn't she working today? She was supposed to be here an hour ago. It's not like her to be late without sending word. I'm getting concerned." Tanner was already moving toward the door. "I'll check the boarding house." He covered the 3 blocks at a near run, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. When he burst through the door of Mrs. Callahan's establishment, he found the landlady in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with vigorous movements. "Is Margaret here?" he asked without preamble. Mrs. Callahan looked up, surprised by his tone. "She's in her room, been up there all morning. I knocked around noon to see if she wanted lunch, but she said she wasn't feeling well." "Which room?" "Top of the stairs, second door on the right." But Tanner, I don't think he was already taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached Margaret's door, he knocked firmly but not aggressively. "Margaret, it's Tanner. Mrs. Henderson's worried about you. Can you let me know you're all right?" Silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, "I'm fine. Please go away." But her voice sounded thick, like she'd been crying, and Tanner felt his concern deepen into something close to fear. "Margaret, I'm not leaving until I know you're okay. You don't have to open the door, but please talk to me." More silence, and then he heard soft footsteps. The door opened a crack and Margaret peered out. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she looked utterly miserable. "What happened?" Tanner asked gently. "Nothing. I can't go to work today. I can't face anyone." Her voice broke on the last word. "Can I come in? Or you can come out here, whichever makes you more comfortable. But Margaret, you're clearly upset, and I'd like to help if I can." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. Her room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Tanner took the chair, making sure to leave plenty of space between them. "Tell me what's wrong," he said. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, and he saw her fingers grip the fabric of her sleeves. "I received a letter this morning, from back east. Someone found out where I went. Someone you don't want to find you." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought I'd gotten far enough away. I thought I was safe." Tanner's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm. "Who is it? Who are you running from?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her wrestling with whether to trust him with the truth. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "My husband." The word hit Tanner like a physical blow. Husband, of course she was married. A woman like her wouldn't be alone unless ex-husband, he asked hopefully. "Not exactly. I ran away from him. We were never legally divorced, but I couldn't stay." "I couldn't." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, and Tanner couldn't stand it anymore. He moved from the chair to sit beside her on the bed, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "It's all right. You're safe here. Whatever happened, you're safe now." "You don't understand," Margaret choked out. "He's dangerous, he's cruel, and if he finds me—" She trailed off, but Tanner could imagine plenty. "Is that why you never roll up your sleeves?" he asked quietly. Even in the heat, Margaret went very still. Then, slowly, she began to unbutton the cuff of her left sleeve. She pushed the fabric up, revealing her forearm, and Tanner felt sick. The scars were old, some of them years healed, but there were so many. Burns and cuts, marks that could only have come from deliberate cruelty. She did the same with the right sleeve, showing him more of the same. "He liked to hurt me where it wouldn't show," she said flatly, her voice empty of emotion, as if she'd retreated somewhere far away to protect herself from the memories. "Said it was my fault, that I made him angry. For years I believed him. Then one day I realized that if I stayed, he would eventually kill me. So I took what little money I'd hidden away and I ran." Tanner had to look away for a moment, had to swallow back the rage that threatened to choke him. When he could trust himself to speak, he said, "You were brave. To leave, to start over. That takes incredible strength." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. This letter, it wasn't from him directly, but from someone asking questions about me in Philadelphia. He's looking for me, Tanner. It's only a matter of time before he finds me. Not if we don't let him." Tanner turned back to her, catching her eye. "You're not alone anymore, Margaret. You've got friends here, people who care about you, and I promise you I won't let him hurt you again." "You can't promise that." "You don't know what he's like. He's wealthy, connected. He could make life very difficult for anyone who helps me. Let him try." Tanner's voice was hard with determination. "This is Missouri, not Philadelphia. Out here, a man's character matters more than his bank account. And if he shows up in Clifton Hill looking for trouble, he'll find a whole town ready to send him packing." Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. "Why would you do this for me? Risk so much for someone you barely know." "Because it's the right thing to do," Tanner said simply. "And because you matter to me, Margaret, more than you probably realize." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but these seemed different somehow, less about fear and more about something else. "Tanner, you don't have to say anything. Just know that you're not alone in this. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." He stood up, giving her space again. "Why don't you wash your face and I'll walk you to work? Mrs. Henderson's worried, and keeping to your routine will help you feel more normal. Plus, it'll show anyone watching that you've got people looking out for you." Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. "You're right. I can't hide in here forever. That's the spirit." While she composed herself, Tanner went downstairs and explained to Mrs. Callahan in vague terms that Margaret had received some troubling news but was all right. The landlady, bless her, didn't pry, just nodded and offered to make Margaret some of her special chamomile tea for later. When Margaret came down, her face washed and her sleeves buttoned firmly back in place, Tanner offered his arm. She took it, and together they walked to Henderson's general store. He could feel her trembling slightly, but she held her head high, and he was proud of her for that. Mrs. Henderson fussed over Margaret when they arrived, but Tanner caught the older woman's eye and shook his head slightly. She understood immediately and switched to chattering about inventory and customer orders, giving Margaret something normal to focus on. Before Tanner left, he pulled Margaret aside. "I'll be back tomorrow. And if you need anything at all, you send someone to fetch me at the ranch. Day or night, I'll come." "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, lying in his bunk at the ranch, Tanner stared at the ceiling and thought about scars and secrets and the kind of man who would hurt a woman. He thought about Margaret's green eyes and careful smiles, about how she'd trusted him enough to show him the truth of what she'd survived. And he realized that what he'd told her was absolutely accurate. She mattered to him, more than he'd been willing to admit even to himself. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have scared him. He'd spent 2 years carefully keeping people at arm's length, not getting too close, not letting anyone matter too much. But somehow Margaret had slipped past all his defenses, had made him want to be brave enough to try again, to risk his heart even knowing it could be broken. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Over the next several weeks, Tanner made sure Margaret was never alone if he could help it. He coordinated with James and some of the other ranch hands to keep an eye out for strangers in town, anyone who seemed to be asking questions or watching too closely. He walked Margaret to and from work when his schedule allowed, and on Sundays, they started taking long walks together, exploring the countryside around Clifton Hill. It was on one of these walks in late October, when the leaves were turning gold and red, that Margaret finally opened up more about her past. They were sitting by the creek, the same spot they'd visited during the social, and Margaret was trailing her fingers through the cool water. She'd rolled her sleeves up to her elbows, something she only did now when it was just the two of them, a sign of trust that made Tanner's chest ache. "I was 17 when I married him," she said suddenly. "Charles Preston. My father had died the year before and my mother was struggling. Charles was older, established, wealthy. Everyone said I was so lucky that he'd chosen me." She laughed bitterly. "I believed them at first. He could be charming when he wanted to be." "When did it change?" Tanner asked quietly. "The night of our wedding. As soon as we were alone, it was like a mask came off. He was angry that I was frightened, that I didn't immediately know how to please him. He grabbed my wrist so hard it bruised, told me I was stupid and useless." She pulled her hand from the water and looked at the scars. "It only got worse from there. For 5 years I endured it. I told myself I had no choice, that I'd made vows before God, that surely I could find a way to be better, to stop making him angry." "It wasn't your fault," Tanner said fiercely. "None of it was your fault. I know that now. But it took a long time to understand it. What finally made me leave was when I saw him looking at our neighbor's daughter the same way he'd looked at me when we first met. She was 16. And I realized that if I stayed, if I kept accepting this as normal, I was complicit in a world that let men like Charles hurt women and get away with it. So you ran." "I took the household money I'd been carefully skimming for months, packed one bag, and left in the middle of the night. I made my way west, changing my route several times to cover my tracks. I thought I'd been so careful." She sighed. "But Charles has resources, and he doesn't like losing what he considers his property." Tanner moved closer, carefully telegraphing his intention, and took her scarred hand in his. "You're not property. You're a person, a strong, brave, beautiful person, and I meant what I said. I won't let him take you back." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm so tired of being afraid, Tanner. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, of jumping at shadows. I want to be free, truly free. Then we'll find a way to make that happen. Maybe it's time to talk to the sheriff, let him know the situation. If Charles shows up, we'll make sure he understands he's not welcome and that you're under the town's protection." "You really think that would work?" "I do." Sheriff Morgan's a good man, and he doesn't take kindly to bullies. Plus, if Charles is as wealthy and connected as you say, he's not going to want a public scandal. Men like that care about their reputations. Margaret considered this, hope beginning to dawn in her eyes. Maybe you're right. Besides, Tanner added, trying to lighten the mood, you've got me now. And I'm pretty stubborn when I want to be. Ask anyone at the ranch. That earned him a genuine smile, the kind that lit up her whole face and made his heart skip. I'm starting to figure that out. They sat there for a while longer, hands still clasped, watching the water flow past. Tanner knew that eventually they'd have to face whatever came next. But for now, in this moment, Margaret was safe and smiling, and that was enough. The meeting with Sheriff Morgan went better than Margaret had dared hope. The lawman listened carefully to her story, his weathered face grave but sympathetic. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Madam, I'm sorry you've had to endure such treatment. No woman deserves that, no matter what. Now, legally speaking, you're still married to this Charles Preston, which complicates things. But morally speaking, you had every right to leave a dangerous situation. And as sheriff of this county, I can promise you that if he shows up here making threats or trying to force you to go with him, he'll find himself in a jail cell faster than he can blink." "Thank you, Sheriff," Margaret said, relief washing over her. "I'll also put the word out to the neighboring counties. Let the other lawmen know to be on the lookout. And Tanner here's right. We'll make sure folks in town know to keep an eye out for strangers asking questions." After they left the sheriff's office, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. "I can't believe how supportive everyone's been. Back east, if a woman left her husband, she'd be shunned, blamed. Things are different out here," Tanner said. "We're all running from something or starting over. Makes people more understanding, I think." As November arrived and the weather turned colder, Margaret found herself spending more and more time with Tanner. They had dinner together several times a week, sometimes at the boarding house with Mrs. Callahan joining them, sometimes at the small restaurant on Main Street. They attended church together on Sundays, and afterward they'd take their now customary walks, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret felt herself falling, slowly but inevitably, in love with this quiet, kind cowboy who had offered her nothing but patience and protection. He made her feel safe in a way she'd never experienced before. But more than that, he made her feel seen, valued, cherished even. When she was with Tanner, she wasn't a victim or a runaway or a woman with a shameful past. She was just Margaret, and that was enough. She could see that Tanner's feelings mirrored her own. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, in how he always made sure she was comfortable and happy, in the soft tone his voice took when he said her name. But he never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He seemed content to let their relationship develop at whatever pace she needed. It was a Saturday evening in late November when things finally came to a head. Tanner had invited Margaret to dinner at the ranch, a rare treat since Bernard didn't usually allow women at the bunkhouse. But Bernard's wife had insisted on meeting the woman who had, in her words, finally gotten Tanner to come out of his shell, and had arranged for a proper dinner in the main house. Margaret was nervous as Tanner helped her down from the wagon, but Mrs. Bailey turned out to be a warm, motherly woman who immediately put her at ease. Dinner was roasted chicken and vegetables, apple pie for dessert, and the conversation flowed easily. Bernard told stories about the ranch, and Tanner added dry commentary that made everyone laugh. After dinner, Tanner asked if Margaret would like to see the horses. They walked out to the barn together, the night air crisp and clean, stars brilliant overhead. Inside the barn, it was warm and smelled of hay and leather. Tanner led her to a stall where a beautiful mare stood, dark brown with a white star on her forehead. "This is Rosie," Tanner said, stroking the horse's nose. "She's my favorite. Gentle as a lamb but faster than lightning when she wants to be." Margaret reached out tentatively and Rosie nuzzled her palm. "She's beautiful. I've been teaching her some tricks. Want to see?" For the next few minutes, Tanner showed off Rosie's abilities, and Margaret laughed with genuine delight as the horse followed his commands. It was such a normal, sweet moment, and Margaret felt her heart swell with affection for this man who was showing off like a boy with a new toy, just to make her smile. When the demonstration ended, they stood close together in the lantern light, and Margaret found herself looking up at Tanner, really looking at him. His face was kind, open, honest, everything Charles had never been. "Tanner," she said softly, "I need to tell you something, all right? I'm falling in love with you. I think I have been for a while now. And I know the situation is complicated with Charles and the marriage that's not really a marriage anymore, but I needed you to know. You've given me so much, been so patient and kind, and I just—" Tanner stopped her words by cupping her face gently in his hands. "Margaret Preston, I've been in love with you since that first day when you stepped off the stage wearing long sleeves in the summer heat and trying so hard to be brave. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and it would be my honor, my absolute honor, to stand by your side for as long as you'll have me." Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "You really mean that? Every word? Can I? Would it be all right if I kissed you?" Tanner smiled, soft and sweet. "I'd like that very much." Margaret rose on her tiptoes, and Tanner bent down to meet her. Their lips touched, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as years of loneliness and longing poured into the kiss. It was nothing like the harsh, demanding kisses Charles had forced on her. This was tender, respectful, full of promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. "The situation with Charles, the legalities, all of it. We'll find a way to make you truly free, and then, if you'll have me, I'd like to marry you proper." "Yes," Margaret breathed. "Yes, I would like that more than anything." They held each other in the warm barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses and the sweet smell of hay. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret felt truly, completely happy. But happiness, as Margaret had learned, was a fragile thing. 2 weeks later, on a cold December morning, Charles Preston arrived in Clifton Hill. Tanner was in town when it happened, having come in to pick up supplies and, as always, to check on Margaret. He was walking toward Henderson's general store when he saw the man dismounting from a fine black horse in front of the sheriff's office. The stranger was well dressed in expensive Eastern clothes, tall and handsome in a sharp-featured way. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Tanner's instincts immediately prickled. He changed direction, following the man at a distance, and his suspicions were confirmed when he heard the stranger speak to Sheriff Morgan in a cultured Philadelphia accent. "I'm looking for my wife, Margaret Preston. I have reason to believe she's in this town." Tanner ducked into the doorway of the feed store, listening intently. "And you are?" Sheriff Morgan's voice was carefully neutral. "Charles Preston. My wife ran away several months ago. She's not well, you understand. Fragile nerves. I'm very concerned for her safety." "That's so. Well, Mr. Preston, if your wife is in my town and doesn't want to be found, I'd say she's got good reason. I assure you, Sheriff, this is a private family matter. My wife belongs with me. Now, I can either find her with your cooperation, or I can make things very difficult for this town. I have considerable resources and political connections." Sheriff Morgan's voice went hard. And I have considerable experience with bullies who think money makes them above the law. You want to find your wife, you'll need more than threats. This is Missouri, Mr. Preston. Out here, we tend to believe a woman has the right to choose where she lives. Tanner didn't wait to hear more. He ran to Henderson's store, bursting through the door with enough force to make the bell jangle wildly. Margaret looked up from behind the counter, her smile fading when she saw his face. "He's here," Tanner said. "Charles is here. He's at the sheriff's office right now." All the color drained from Margaret's face. "No, no, he can't be. I was so careful." Mrs. Henderson came out from the back room. "What's happening?" "Margaret's husband is in town," Tanner explained quickly. "We need to keep her safe." "Take her to my house," Mrs. Henderson said immediately. "John's there and he won't let anyone in. Go now through the back door." Tanner grabbed Margaret's hand, and they rushed out the back entrance, making their way through the alleys to the Henderson house on the edge of town. John Henderson, a retired cavalry soldier who'd lost his leg in the war, answered their frantic knock and listened to their explanation with a grim expression. "Don't you worry, miss," he said, checking the rifle he kept by the door. "Anyone tries to come through here uninvited will regret it." Margaret was shaking, her face pale with fear. Tanner pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "It's going to be all right. The sheriff won't tell him where you are, and we've got people looking out for you. You don't know Charles. He won't give up. He'll search every building, threaten everyone, make life miserable until he gets what he wants. Then he's about to learn that Clifton Hill doesn't respond well to threats." And indeed, word spread through the town faster than wildfire. By noon, everyone knew that a fancy Eastern gentleman was looking for Margaret Preston, and that he wasn't the kind of man who deserved to find her. The town, to its credit, closed ranks. When Charles Preston went to the boarding house, Mrs. Callahan told him she'd never heard of any Margaret Preston. When he tried the general store, Mrs. Henderson said the same. Every business, every home, every person he asked gave him the same answer. They didn't know anyone by that name. Frustrated and angry, Charles returned to the sheriff's office. Tanner, who had positioned himself across the street, watched as the confrontation escalated. "This is obstruction of justice," Charles shouted loud enough for half the street to hear. "That woman is my legal wife, and these people are harboring her." "These people are telling you they don't know where she is," Sheriff Morgan replied calmly. "Now, you can accept that and move on, or you can keep making a scene. But I warn you, Mr. Preston, folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and making demands. I'll have your badge for this. You're welcome to try. In the meantime, I suggest you leave town before things get unpleasant." Charles looked around at the faces watching him from windows and doorways, and he must have realized he was outnumbered. With a final venomous glare, he mounted his horse and rode out of town. But Tanner wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Men like Charles didn't give up that easily. He was proven right when, 3 days later, a lawyer arrived in Clifton Hill with papers demanding Margaret's return to Philadelphia to face charges of theft and abandonment. Sheriff Morgan reviewed the documents and then called a town meeting. The church was packed that evening, with nearly every adult in Clifton Hill in attendance. Margaret sat in the front row between Tanner and Mrs. Callahan, her face pale but determined. Sheriff Morgan stood at the front and explained the situation. "Now, these papers are legal, technically speaking," he said. "But they're also a load of horse manure, if you'll pardon my language. Mr. Preston is trying to use the law to force his wife back to a dangerous situation. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Bernard Bailey stood up. "Seems to me the law isn't always right. Sometimes you have to do what's moral instead." "Agreed," said Mr. Patterson from the feed store. "Margaret's one of us now. We don't abandon our own." Mrs. Henderson rose, her voice ringing clear. "I propose we help Margaret get a proper divorce. There are lawyers in Kansas City who specialize in such things. It'll cost money, but if we all chip in—" "I'll cover the legal fees," Bernard interrupted. "Consider it done." Tanner felt Margaret trembling beside him and squeezed her hand. All around the room people were nodding, offering support, pledging to help however they could. Margaret started to cry, overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "I don't deserve all of you." "Yes, you do," Tanner said firmly. "You deserve all the good things, Margaret, and we're going to make sure you get them." The next several months were a legal battle. Bernard hired the best lawyer in Kansas City, a sharp woman named Elizabeth Thornton who specialized in helping women escape bad marriages. Mrs. Thornton was relentless, documenting Margaret's scars, gathering testimony from the doctor in Clifton Hill who examined her, building a case that Charles Preston was an abusive husband who posed a danger to his wife. Charles fought back with his own lawyers, trying to paint Margaret as mentally unstable, a thief, a woman of loose morals. But Mrs. Thornton was better. She found other women Charles had courted before Margaret, women who told similar stories of charm that turned to cruelty. She uncovered financial irregularities in Charles's business dealings. Slowly, methodically, she destroyed his credibility. During all of this, Margaret stayed in Clifton Hill, protected by the town and supported by Tanner. Their relationship deepened during those difficult months. They spent every free moment together, talking about their pasts, their dreams for the future, falling more deeply in love with each passing day. Tanner told her about his own past, about the family he'd lost in Texas to a fever outbreak, about how he'd wandered aimlessly for a year before finding Clifton Hill and deciding to put down roots. Margaret shared more about her years with Charles, the fear and pain, but also the small acts of defiance that had kept her spirit alive. They learned each other's scars, both visible and invisible, and found that sharing their wounds somehow made them lighter. In April of 1879, nearly a year after Margaret had first arrived in Clifton Hill, the divorce was finalized. Mrs. Thornton sent a telegram with the news, and the entire town celebrated. Margaret was finally, legally free. That evening, Tanner took her back to their spot by the creek. The spring air was sweet with the smell of wildflowers, and the water sparkled in the fading sunlight. They sat on the grass, and Tanner pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we've talked about this," he said, his voice nervous despite the fact that he already knew her answer. "But I wanted to do it proper. Margaret Preston, you're the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. You've made me believe in love again, in hope, in the possibility of good things. Would you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but Margaret looked at it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Tanner, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, and then they were kissing, laughing, holding each other as the sun set over the Missouri landscape. Everything they'd been through, all the fear and pain and struggle had led them to this moment, and it was perfect. They were married a month later in May when the wildflowers were at their peak. The ceremony was held outside the church, with what seemed like the entire county in attendance. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Callahan had sewn for her, and for the first time since Tanner had known her, she wore short sleeves. Her scars were visible to everyone, but she held her head high, no longer ashamed of what she'd survived. Tanner stood at the altar in his best suit, watching her walk toward him on Bernard Bailey's arm, and he thought his heart might burst from happiness. When she reached him and took his hands, he saw his own joy reflected in her eyes. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Tanner barely heard the words. He was too focused on Margaret, on the way the sunlight caught in her hair, on the smile that lit up her entire face, on the knowledge that this incredible woman had chosen him, trusted him, loved him. When it came time for the vows, Tanner spoke from his heart. "Margaret, I promise to always be your safe place. I promise to listen when you need to talk, to hold you when you need comfort, to stand beside you when you need strength. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you every day for the rest of my life." Margaret's voice was clear and strong when she replied, "Tanner, you showed me what kindness looks like when I'd forgotten. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to support your dreams, to build a life with you filled with joy and laughter. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your love always." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Tanner kissed his bride to the sound of cheers and applause. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, and Tanner felt like the luckiest man alive. The celebration lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. Margaret danced with Tanner, then with Bernard, then with Sheriff Morgan and half a dozen other men who'd helped protect her. She was radiant, glowing with happiness, and Tanner couldn't stop watching her. As the stars came out and the party began to wind down, Tanner and Margaret slipped away to the small house on the edge of town that Bernard had helped them buy. It was modest, just 3 rooms, but it was theirs, a place where they could build their future together. Inside, with the door closed behind them and the sounds of celebration fading in the distance, Tanner turned to his wife. "Hello, Mrs. Brooks." Margaret smiled, that full, unreserved smile he'd worked so hard to earn. "Hello, Mr. Brooks." He kissed her gently, reverently, and when she responded with equal tenderness, he felt a wave of gratitude for this second chance at happiness. They'd both been broken by their pasts, but together they were healing, becoming whole. That night, with patience and love and whispered words of affection, they consummated their marriage. It was nothing like what Margaret had experienced with Charles. Tanner was gentle, attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, Margaret cried tears of joy. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what? For seeing me, for saving me, for loving me." Tanner kissed the top of her head. "You saved yourself, darling. I just had the privilege of being there when you did." The years that followed were good ones, better than either of them had dared to hope for. Tanner continued working at the Double B Ranch, eventually becoming Bernard's foreman when the position opened up. Margaret kept working at Henderson's General Store for a while, then started her own small business doing bookkeeping for the various shops and businesses in town. She had a head for numbers and organization, and people valued her services. They built a life together filled with simple pleasures. Sunday dinners with friends, evening walks by the creek, quiet nights reading together by the fire. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, but they'd both learned from their pasts how to communicate, how to listen, how to fight fair and always come back to love. In the spring of 1881, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. Tanner was beside himself with joy and terror in equal measure. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she wasn't working too hard, that she was eating enough, that she felt well. Margaret bore his hovering with good humor, though she did have to remind him more than once that pregnancy wasn't an illness. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby with Tanner's dark hair and Margaret's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Tanner's father, and he was the most perfect thing either of them had ever seen. Holding his son for the first time, Tanner made a silent vow. This child would grow up knowing only love and safety. He would never have to fear the people who were supposed to protect him. Tanner would make sure of it. Margaret recovered well from the birth, and when Thomas was a few months old, she surprised Tanner one evening by rolling up her sleeves without any self-consciousness. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were just a part of her history, proof that she'd survived, that she'd overcome. "I've been thinking," she said, nursing the baby while Tanner sat beside her, "about women like me who are trapped in bad situations. I want to help them." "How so?" "I thought maybe we could set up a sort of safe house. A place where women could come if they needed to escape, needed time to figure out their next steps. Mrs. Callahan's getting older, and she's mentioned wanting to sell the boarding house. We could buy it, run it as a refuge." Tanner considered this. "That's a big undertaking, and potentially dangerous if angry husbands come looking." "I know. But Tanner, if someone had offered me that kind of help when I first started thinking about leaving Charles, it might have saved me years of suffering. I want to be that help for others." He looked at his wife, at the determination in her eyes, and fell in love with her all over again. "All right, let's do it." They bought Mrs. Callahan's boarding house and transformed it into what they called simply the refuge. Word spread slowly at first, through networks of women who whispered to each other about the place in Missouri where you could go if you needed help. Over the next few years, they sheltered dozens of women, helped them get divorces, find work, start new lives. Some stayed in Clifton Hill, others moved on, but all of them left stronger than they'd arrived. Margaret managed the day-to-day operations while Tanner provided protection and financial support. It was exhausting, often heartbreaking work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. They were making a difference, creating change one woman at a time. In 1883, they had a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth after the lawyer who'd helped Margaret get her divorce. Beth, as they called her, was a firecracker from the start, all energy and opinions and fierce independence. Tanner adored her, and Margaret laughed watching him get wrapped around his daughter's tiny finger. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, gentle boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. He was protective of his little sister and kind to the women who came through the refuge. Both children grew up understanding that some people had harder lives than others, and that it was their responsibility to help when they could. By 1885, the refuge was well established, and Clifton Hill had earned a reputation as a place where women could find sanctuary. Margaret received letters from all over the country, women thanking her for giving them hope, for showing them that escape was possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset, Thomas and Beth playing in the yard, Margaret leaned her head on Tanner's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked. "When you first saw me step off that stage," Tanner thought about it, about the frightened woman in long sleeves who'd flinched from his touch, about all the moments between then and now. "I don't know if I imagined it exactly," he said slowly. "But I hoped for it. I saw something in you that first day, something strong and bright that deserved better than whatever you were running from. I hoped I could help you find it. You did more than help me find it. You helped me become it." Margaret laced her fingers through his, and he could feel the scars on her wrists, permanent reminders of where she'd been. "I love you, Tanner Brooks. Thank you for noticing, for caring, for only offering kindness when I desperately needed it. I love you too, Margaret. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned pink and gold, their children's laughter floating on the evening air, surrounded by the life they'd built together from the ashes of their painful pasts. The years continued to roll by. each one bringing new challenges and new joys. In 1887, they expanded the refuge, adding more rooms and hiring staff to help with the increased number of women seeking shelter. Margaret became something of a local celebrity, though she was uncomfortable with the attention. She just wanted to help, she said, to make sure no woman felt as alone and trapped as she once had. Tanner eventually bought a partnership in the Double B Ranch, and he and Bernard expanded the operation, becoming one of the most successful cattle operations in that part of Missouri. The money was good, but more importantly, it allowed Tanner to support Margaret's work with the refuge without financial strain. Thomas, when he turned 16, announced that he wanted to study law. He wanted to be like Mrs. Thornton, he said, helping people who couldn't fight for themselves. Tanner and Margaret were immensely proud, and they started saving to send him to university in Kansas City. Beth, at 13, was already showing signs of following in her mother's footsteps. She volunteered at the refuge, helping with the younger children who came with their mothers, teaching them to read and play. She had Margaret's compassion and Tanner's quiet strength, and they knew she'd do great things. In the summer of 1890, Margaret received a letter that made her go pale. It was from a lawyer in Philadelphia, informing her that Charles Preston had died of a heart attack. He'd left no will, and his estate was in chaos, but the lawyer thought Margaret should know that she was finally, completely free of any legal connection to her past. Margaret took the news to the creek, to the spot where she and Tanner had shared so many important moments. He found her there, sitting on the bank, the letter in her hands. "You all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. "He's dead. Charles is dead." Tanner put his arm around her and she leaned into him. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know." Relieved mostly, but also sad in a strange way. Not sad for him, but sad for all the wasted years, for the man he could have been if he'd chosen differently. She looked up at Tanner. "I don't want to become bitter, to let what he did poison the rest of my life." "You could never be bitter. You've spent the last decade turning your pain into purpose, helping other women avoid your fate. If anything, you've taken something terrible and made it beautiful." Margaret smiled and kissed him softly. "We've made it beautiful. I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Sure you could have. You're the strongest person I know." He took her hand, running his thumb over the scars that had faded but never disappeared. "These don't define you, you know. They're just a part of your story, and your story is one of survival and triumph. I know that now. It took me a long time, but I finally understand that I'm not what was done to me. I'm what I chose to become despite it." They sat by the creek until the sun set, talking about the past and the future, about Charles and the life Margaret had escaped, about the children they'd raised and the women they'd helped. It was a moment of closure, a final letting go of the fear that had haunted Margaret for so many years. That night, they made love with the windows open to the summer breeze, slowly and sweetly, reaffirming their commitment to each other and to the life they'd built. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret felt a peace she'd never thought possible. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what, darling? For being patient. For seeing past the fear and the scars to the person underneath. For loving me when I didn't think I deserved to be loved." Tanner tightened his arms around her. "You've always deserved to be loved, Margaret. Always. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." In 1892, Thomas left for university, and the house felt empty without his steady presence. But he came home for holidays and summers, full of stories about his studies and his plans for the future. He'd met a girl, he told them shyly during Christmas break, a fellow law student named Catherine who shared his passion for justice. Margaret and Tanner exchanged knowing looks and smiled. Beth blossomed into a beautiful and confident young woman, though she showed no interest in courtship or marriage. She was too busy, she said, helping at the refuge and planning to become a teacher. She wanted to educate girls, to give them options and opportunities beyond just becoming wives and mothers. Margaret supported her completely, understanding that her daughter wanted the freedom to choose her own path, something Margaret herself had been denied in her youth. By 1895, Tanner and Margaret had been married for 16 years, and they were more in love than ever. They'd weathered storms together, celebrated triumphs, raised children, built businesses, and changed lives. Their hair was starting to show threads of silver, and their bodies carried the marks of age and hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they'd fallen in love with all those years ago. On their anniversary that May, Tanner surprised Margaret by taking her back to the spot where he'd proposed. The creek looked exactly the same, eternally flowing, eternally constant. They sat on the bank and Tanner pulled out a small package. "What's this?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Open it." Inside was a leather-bound journal, blank pages waiting to be filled. "I thought maybe you could write your story," Tanner explained. "Everything that happened, everything you survived, everything you've accomplished, not for anyone else necessarily, but for you. And maybe someday for Beth, or for the women who come to the refuge, so they can see that survival is possible, that happiness after trauma is real." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "This is perfect, thank you." She started writing that very night, documenting her journey from that terrified girl in Philadelphia to the confident woman she'd become. It was painful at times, revisiting the memories, but it was also cathartic. And as she wrote, she realized how far she'd truly come, how much she'd grown. The journal became a project that consumed her free time for the next year. She wrote about Charles and the abuse, about the long journey to Missouri, about stepping off that stage into the blazing heat. She wrote about Tanner, about his kindness and patience, about falling in love and learning to trust again. She wrote about Thomas and Beth, about the refuge, about all the women she'd helped and the ones she'd failed to save. When she finally finished, she had a complete record of her life, honest and raw and real. She showed it to Tanner, who read it with tears streaming down his face. "This is powerful," he said when he finished. "This could help so many people. You think I should try to publish it?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But yes, I think it could do a lot of good." Margaret sent the manuscript to Elizabeth Thornton, who had connections in the publishing world. Mrs. Thornton was enthusiastic and helped Margaret find a publisher. In 1897, From Scars to Strength, One Woman's Journey was published under Margaret's name. The book created a sensation. It was one of the first times a woman had written so openly about domestic abuse and survival. Margaret received hundreds of letters from women thanking her for telling her story, for giving them courage to leave their own dangerous situations. The book also attracted criticism from those who thought such private matters shouldn't be discussed publicly. But Margaret didn't care. If her story helped even one woman, it was worth it. The success of the book brought more attention and donations to the refuge, allowing them to expand even further. By 1900, they were sheltering up to 20 women at a time, and they'd helped establish similar refuges in 3 other Missouri towns. Thomas graduated from law school and opened his practice in Kansas City, specializing in family law and divorce cases. He married Catherine in a beautiful ceremony, and Margaret cried happy tears watching her son pledge his life to a woman he clearly adored and respected. They would have 2 children of their own, making Margaret and Tanner grandparents. Beth became a teacher as she'd planned, opening a school specifically for girls in Clifton Hill. She taught her students not just reading and mathematics, but also critical thinking and self-sufficiency. She never married, content with her independence and her work, and Margaret admired her daughter's choices even as some in town whispered that it wasn't natural for a woman to remain unmarried. As the new century dawned, Tanner and Margaret looked back on their lives with satisfaction. They'd built something meaningful, created a legacy that would outlast them. The refuge continued to thrive, and women from all over the country knew that Clifton Hill, Missouri, was a place of safety and hope. On a quiet evening in 1903, they sat together on the porch of their house, watching the sunset just as they had so many times before. Tanner was 61 now, his hair more silver than brown, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. Margaret was 60, her beauty softened by age but still present in the brightness of her eyes and the warmth of her smile. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked, her hand in his. Tanner thought about it. "Not a single one. Everything I've been through, good and bad, led me to you. Led me to this life. How could I regret any of that? I feel the same way. Even the painful parts, they made me who I am. They brought me here to you, to this place where I finally found peace. And love," Tanner added, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her scarred wrist tenderly. "Never forget the love." "Never," Margaret promised. "I could never forget that." They sat in silence as the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink. The Missouri landscape spread out before them like a promise. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear children laughing, probably their grandchildren visiting from Kansas City. The sound made Margaret smile. "We did good, didn't we?" she asked. "We did better than good. We did great." Tanner pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, perfectly content. The years continued to pass gently. Tanner retired from active ranch work at 65, though he still consulted and helped with the books. Margaret handed over the day-to-day management of the refuge to a younger woman they'd trained, though she still visited daily and remained involved in major decisions. They spent more time with their grandchildren, spoiling them appropriately and telling them stories about the old days. They took leisurely walks by the creek, traveled occasionally to visit Thomas in Kansas City, and enjoyed the slower pace that came with age. In 1910, on a warm June evening, Tanner suffered a heart attack. It was sudden and severe, and though the doctor came quickly, there was little he could do. Margaret sat by Tanner's bedside, holding his hand, their children on either side. "I love you," Tanner whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Best thing I ever did was offer you kindness that day. Best decision of my life." "I love you too," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for everything. For seeing me, for saving me, for loving me." "You saved yourself," Tanner reminded her, just as he had that first night they'd made love. "I just got to be there for it." He died peacefully, with Margaret's hand in his and surrounded by love. Margaret was devastated but not destroyed. She'd learned years ago that she was stronger than she looked, more resilient than anyone expected. And she knew Tanner wouldn't want her to give up, to stop living. She continued working with the refuge, continued writing, continued being active in her community. She missed Tanner every single day, but she also felt his presence in everything she did. He'd given her the courage to become who she was meant to be, and she honored his memory by continuing to be that person. Margaret lived to be 83 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1926. In the nearly 5 decades since she'd first arrived in Clifton Hill, she'd helped over 500 women escape abusive situations and start new lives. Her book had been reprinted multiple times and was being used in universities to teach about women's rights and domestic violence. She'd raised 2 remarkable children and enjoyed 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. But perhaps most importantly, She'd proven that it was possible to survive the worst that life could throw at you and still find happiness, still find love, still make a difference in the world. At her funeral, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, Beth stood to give the eulogy. She spoke about her mother's courage, her compassion, her unshakable belief that people deserved kindness and second chances. She talked about the love story between Margaret and Tanner, about how one cowboy's simple act of kindness on a hot August day had changed everything. "My mother used to tell me that the scars on her wrists were a reminder," Beth said, her voice strong and clear. Not a reminder of what was done to her, but of what she'd survived. Of her strength, her resilience, her refusal to be defined by her pain. "She taught me and everyone she met that our past doesn't have to determine our future. That with courage and support and love, we can become anything we choose to be." As they laid Margaret to rest beside Tanner in the Clifton Hill Cemetery, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the gathering. It felt like a benediction, a blessing on a life well lived, and a love that had transcended time and circumstance. The refuge continued operating for decades after Margaret's death, eventually becoming a model for similar organizations across the country. Margaret's book remained in print, inspiring new generations of women to leave dangerous situations and seek better lives. And in Clifton Hill, Missouri, the story of the woman who never rolled her sleeves past her wrists and the cowboy who noticed but only offered kindness became legend, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change the world. Years later, great-grandchildren who never met Margaret or Tanner would hear their story and be moved by it. They would learn that love isn't always dramatic or flashy, that sometimes it's quiet and patient and kind. That the most powerful thing you can offer someone who's hurting is simple compassion without expectations. That seeing someone's pain and responding with gentleness, rather than judgment, can be revolutionary. The little house on the edge of Clifton Hill still stood decades later, occupied by new families but maintained with care out of respect for its history. The creek where Tanner and Margaret had shared so many important moments continued to flow, eternal and unchanging. And on summer evenings, when the light slanted gold across the Missouri landscape, it wasn't hard to imagine a young cowboy and a frightened woman in long sleeves, taking their first tentative steps toward a love that would change both their lives forever. Their story became more than just a romance. It became a testament to the power of kindness, the possibility of healing, and the transformative nature of love that sees past scars to the person beneath. It showed that happy endings aren't just possible for the perfect or the lucky, but for anyone brave enough to accept help and courageous enough to start again. And so, in the end, Margaret Preston Brooks and Tanner Brooks left behind more than just children and grandchildren, more than just the refuge and the book and the changed laws. They left behind hope. Hope that no matter how dark the past, the future could be bright. Hope that broken people could become whole. Hope that a chance encounter on a dusty street in a small Missouri town could blossom into a love story for the ages. The woman who never rolled her sleeves past her wrists learned to bear her scars without shame. The cowboy who noticed but only offered kindness received a lifetime of love in return. And together, they proved that sometimes the best love stories aren't about passion and drama, but about patience and understanding and two wounded souls helping each other heal. Their legacy lived on in every woman who found refuge, in every person who chose kindness over judgment, in every couple who built their love on foundations of respect and trust, rather than possession and control. The scars remained, as scars do, but they no longer defined anything except the strength it took to survive them. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that our wounds, whether physical or emotional, don't have to be the end of our story. They can be the beginning of something new, something better, something beautiful. All it takes is courage, compassion, and someone willing to offer kindness without conditions. In Clifton Hill, Missouri, where the creek still runs and the wildflowers still bloom each spring, the memory of Margaret and Tanner Brooks lives on. Not as a tragedy overcome, but as a triumph celebrated. Not as victims who survived, but as heroes who thrived. Not as a sad story with a happy ending, but as a joyful story that acknowledged pain while refusing to be defined by it. And every year on a warm August day, someone places wildflowers on their graves, a silent thank you for showing the world that love, real love, looks like kindness first and always. That the greatest romance isn't about sweeping gestures and grand declarations, but about seeing someone truly, completely, scars and all, and choosing to stay, to support, to cherish. The woman who stepped off the stage in long sleeves found her home. The cowboy who offered only kindness found his heart. And together, they created something that outlasted them both. A legacy of hope, healing, and the enduring power of love freely given and gratefully received. Their story ended not with sorrow, but with satisfaction. Not with regret, but with gratitude. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and made the world a better place. They had proven that second chances are real, that fresh starts are possible, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply to be kind. And in the end, that kindness saved them both.